So I'm really pleased to meet with you, Nathan Lentz, Dr. Lentz, and the author of this book that I find very exciting. It's called The Sexual Evolution: How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. It's a book of interest of mine, and I'm sure a lot of other people as well. Um, just a little bit from your cover. Uh, you're a professor of biology at John Jay College, University of New York, and author of Human Errors and Not So Different, in addition to this book. So, welcome. I'm pleased to have the time to spend with you today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. Well, I when I interview authors, I start with asking them a little bit about, in a sense, your origin story. How did how did you get involved, and how did you first get interested in these, very both timely and interesting areas of sexuality and human relating, and how it ties in with the broader world of the animal kingdom and so much more. How did you get started?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's an interesting answer because if you look at my research, the articles I published and the work that I've done over the course of my career, it's all very molecular, cellular. I'm really a geneticist. I study genes and how they work. I study genomes and how they evolve. So the two categories I typically find myself in is evolutionary biology and genetics. And this isn't really a book that's right in my research interest. So most people are kind of surprised. But actually, my first book was the same way. So I'm interested in the human experience and the human nature and the human condition, why we are the way that we are. And I spend a lot of time in my work studying human unique genetics. So what genetics do humans have that other species don't? And then in my science writing, I write a lot about what we have in common with everything else. And so it's really looking at two very different ways of looking at humans. One is our continuity with other animals, and one is what makes us different. But I've always felt that you really need both perspectives in order to understand who we are and where we came from. We are a very unique creature. We're the only one that writes poetry and does calculus and builds skyscrapers and holds elections. But yet we also have, the vast majority of our ancestors going all the way back billions of years are in common with lots of other creatures. So we have a lot that we have in common and a lot that makes us different. And I spend my life studying one or the other of those. So that's how I got involved. That's how I got interested in animal behavior and our evolutionary relationships with other animals. But how I got interested in gender, sex, and sexuality specifically has more to do with the peculiarities of my job, my day job. And I'm a teacher part of my day. I'm a researcher part of my day. And I teach a class called the Biology of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality. And I've been teaching that for about 15 years. And when I was teaching that was really my first introduction into the scientific study of sex and gender. I mean, we all have an experience of sex and gender. We all live in sexed bodies. We live in a gendered world. We interact with one another in sexual ways. So we all have firsthand experience with gender and sex. So when I started teaching about it, 15 or so years ago, was when I first started my introduction to the scientific study of this, which is very, very different than a firsthand experience of it. And so how other scientists look at gender and sex, and it really was a steep learning curve, and I had a blast doing it. But where this book came from specifically was I had students, find articles in the literature, and I was interested in animal behavior. So they would find other animals and other creatures and write about their sexed lives. And things kept coming up over and over again every year that I taught this class, where it seemed like scientists themselves were sort of ignoring sexual diversity. So there were always these footnotes or parts of the chart that they didn't really talk about, where they would said, well, 20% of the males don't really do this behavior. And so they sort of put them to the side and didn't explore it. And that kept happening over and over again. And my scratching the head of why scientists weren't really looking at the full picture, rather they were just looking at sort of what I call the archetypes. So this is what a male typically does. This is what a female typically looks like. They would really just hone in on the archetypes. And that led me to the work of Joan Roughgarden. And Joan Roughgarden wrote a book, I think in 2004 is when it was first published, And it was called Evolution's Rainbow. And it was the first book I could find dedicated to exploring the diversity, meaning the individuals in the population that didn't quite fit the dominant mold, and actually gave life to these minority morphs. And a lot of times biologists use the word morphs to talk about variation. So the sexual morphs that nobody else was studying, Joan Roughgarden really started turning her attention to these I don't know what you want to call them. Sometimes you would call them runts, or sometimes you would call them, just variants. And what she found, and what now we have 25 years of work since then have found, is that there's a lot of diversity in sexed bodies, in gendered behaviors, in sexual relationships, in all kinds of creatures. Basically, any creature whose sexual lives we've actually bothered to study in full detail, we're finding a whole bunch of diversity. And that's what I kept finding when I was teaching this class is, and of course the students were fascinated to see this too, because they've always been taught of this very simple binary that males behave this way and look this way, females behave this way and look this way, and then they come together occasionally to have sex and reproduce. And that was all there was to it. And right now, diversity is sort of a hot topic in biology because of how much it was ignored. So that's really the origin of the book. That's what made me think, there's a book here. First of all, there was the book already written by Joan Roughgarden, but I felt like a lot has happened in the last 25 years.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was time for an update. So I very humbly proposed my book as sort of a sequel to Evolution's Rainbow. And I have the good fortune of being friends with Joan Roughgarden, and she's been a champion of my book the way that I'm a champion of hers. And I think they really tell the story of underappreciated diversity in the natural world.
Well, thank you, and that explains a good deal about why my interest is. My background is I'm an evolutionary trained clinician, and I was in medical school before I went back later and found that medicine at that time was too restrictive. Later went back, got a PhD in international health. But I'm mainly a clinician that works with marriages and families and relationships and diversity of all kinds of the messy human thing that we all are. So when I found your book, it really opened up, I think, some new areas. It's different than a lot of what I've read in the literature, and for me, at least, much more down to earth in terms of how do we actually relate in the human world. So one of the things I wanted to just ask you a little bit more to talk about was to unpack the title a little bit. The sexual evolution, because I think evolution and relate is often ignored, and we can't ignore that. So say a little bit more about that part of the title, and then we'll delve a little more deeply and unpack other layers.
Right. Well, it's a twofold meaning. I know a good title should be a pun in some way, playing on different words. So it's a twofold meaning. So it's obviously a play on the term the sexual revolution. So if going back to particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, there was sort of a sexual upheaval where a lot of members of our society were sort of shaking off some of the restrictions around sexual activity. So premarital sex in particular, and sexual relationships, and sexual freedom, and including in some cases homosexuality. But in general, it was a sexual liberation that happened in the 60s and 70s. So what the reason why we chose the sexual evolution is we're now seeing what I consider a second sexual revolution that's going on in the society around us. But this time it has much more to do with gender, gender fluidity and gender exploration, gender nonconformity. But it spills over, of course, into relationships. You're seeing an increase in non-monogamy and other kinds of polyamory or open relationships or serial monogamy or whatever. Lots of different kinds of relationships along with the gender. So this is kind of another form of that sexual upheaval that's going on. So it's a play on that. And then the reason why it's evolution is that what I'm hoping to do, the main message of the book, this is the money shot, is this upheaval that we're seeing now, I believe, is a rediscovery of a much more open and fluid relationship with gender and sex that we used to have, that our ancestors had, that other species still have. It's really only humans. When you look at social mammals, it's really only humans that have this very restrictive sense of what sex should be, what sex is and when it's appropriate. And, when it comes to sex, gender, and sexuality, we've kind of boxed ourselves in with these societal constraints. We've been shooting all over each other, if you'll take my meaning.
Yeah,
And instead, if we have a more expansive, flexible, and non-judgmental way to look at it, we'll actually see that we have a lot in common with other animals. A lot of other animals kind of explore sex and sexuality in all kinds of different ways. Sex is not just about procreation, and it's not just restricted to a breeding pair. And deviations around sexed bodies and gender behaviors are totally the norm. You do have kind of a bell curve, and there are some standard, more common ways of being, but there's a lot of diversity, and that diversity is often beneficial. So the reason why I'm calling it the sexual evolution is I feel like we are evolving uh, to where we should have been or always had been, without all of the societal strictures. And I do want to say that people who are very invested in some of those societal strictures, whether it's the nuclear family or heteronormative ways of thinking about that, in a sense, this book doesn't really unsettle you, because I'm not saying that there's any problem with any of those things. If you're very committed to, a lifelong, of sexual fidelity in a marriage and all that, that's great. If that works for you, it works for lots of people. I have no problem with that. And I don't think you'll find many people who will
right,
condemn you for that. It's really being more open to other forms of gender expression, sexual
right.
identity, family relationships. It's a rediscovery of that flexibility that I think we naturally have and used to have in our deep past. So that's where the title comes from.
Gotcha. Well, as you know, I've written in the field that's broadly based gender-specific medicine, and I work specifically and particularly with men and men's health. Although you can't work with men without working with women, and we're all
Mhm.
part of this. And in one of my recent books, 12 Rules for Good Men, uh, I was trying to see, well, evolutionarily, how far back does maleness and
Mhm.
femaleness go? And I had read somewhere that, it goes back a billion years. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, that's a long time to have, sexuality in the world. And I was interested in what you said in your book, and I just quote, you said that every body part and every behavior in the realm of sex, gender, and sexuality began with the emergence of these two very peculiar types of cells, the sperm and the egg, around 2 billion years ago. And in your subtitle, you say how 500 million years of sex, gender, and mating shape modern relationships. So, talk a little bit about this, you know, very, very long, evolutionary history, obviously not just in human, but throughout the animal, plants, and, goes way back about all of the sexuality and in
Right.
all its many forms that has been around for so long.
Right. So, what we found is the early evolution of mating types is what it would have first been, even before
Right.
we would talk about sexes. We would talk about mating types, so different forms, that were sort of mutually self-incompatible but mutually compatible. Um, there are a lot of theories. A book just came out this summer, theorizing about how this could happen. We're still debating how and why this happened, because it seems advantageous, but also how did you get there in the first place? How was it advantageous along the way? It's confusing. We're still working some of this out. But one thing we know is that the advantages of sex must outweigh the disadvantages, because it keeps popping up in several different lineages. Animals invented sex separately than plants, than fungi, and then various protists and algae and things. All kinds of different organisms use this recombining of cells, and we use it in different ways and with different origins. So it must hold enormous value to a lineage. And we know that that value is in part due to diversity. Because when you have two individuals mixing their genome, what you get are possibilities. this gene with that one, and this form is slightly better than this one, but when you combine it with this one, then it can do this. And that recombining, you can just imagine if you have two separate Lego sets, right? You can build this with this Lego set, and you can build, but when you put them together, all kinds of new things become possible. Now, most of those might not be good, great. If you put a wing on a car, it doesn't help much, right? So, the mixing and matching is very error prone. It's very sloppy. Most of it's going to lead nowhere. But occasionally you get a new combination that offers some new function, some new ability, and then that takes off and then will give rise to more experimentation. So what we know about sex and the recombining of genomes is that recombination that happens is really the source of all ingenuity, of all innovation, of all evolutionary advancement, if you will. And advancement is kind of a loaded term, but innovation might be the safer way to say it. And so I date this back with the molecules 2 billion years, but that's not what's so interesting to me with this book. I'm talking about behavior. I'm talking about animals. So I go back 500 million years, which is really the origin of animals as a group of organisms, because animals, unlike fungi, plants, and anything else, animals have this very peculiar thing we call behavior. We behave, right? We do things much more actively, not just with our molecules, but with our brains, and we analyze and react and all these kinds of things. And that has, and mostly what we're interested in as human beings, most human beings are interested in the behaviors of this. The molecules are important, the genes and all that stuff, but leave that to the scientists in the laboratory. All humans have an experience of sex, gender, and sexuality when it comes to their body, when it comes to their behavior. So I go back 500 million years and I think about the earliest animals. Well, the earliest sexual animals were hermaphroditic. So they did have two kinds of cells, eggs and sperm, but they didn't have two kinds of bodies, right?
Mm,
And what we find is even back then, when all of the individuals are at least potentially the same, they still have something of a battle of the sexes because they want to donate sperm, but they don't necessarily want to donate eggs, right? So they have this kind of conflict of interest when they come together. And the thesis of my book is that sets the stage for everything else that comes afterwards. Is once you have that conflict of interest, then behavior is going to come on board and you're going to fight. So you can have, and I describe this in my book, you have two flatworms. So these are some of the simplest animals that exist. And they each have two penises and they have one vulva, and they still fight with each other for hours sometimes over the privilege of who gets to be the father.
mm.
Right? And so, and that might seem like a simple, even silly example, but it actually, you can map that kind of struggle onto all of our sexual behaviors because, like I said, it sets the stage for more and more increasing complexity. So it does come down to two types of cells, but the recombining can take all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and you have all kinds of breeding combinations. And in fact, you have some creatures that'll have hermaphrodites and males. They don't have only females, they have males and hermaphrodites. And even that sets up a kind of curious sort of dichotomy. Like, what are the different pressures on a hermaphrodite versus a male? And I talk a lot about that in my book. And then I go into sex switching organisms, and then I go, those are sequential hermaphrodites,
Right.
and then it goes on up from there.
Well, there's so many things that were fascinating to me about the book and its uniqueness. And in the world that I work in, where I kind of see two different kinds of people if we're looking at this type and that type. One are people who really feel like, the very rigid binary just doesn't work. I just don't fit, and
Hmm.
all the things males do this and females do that, and never the
Hmm.
twain shall meet.
Hmm.
And you've got, as you say, people who feel very comfortable and, with this fairly, hey, this is me, you know, and you say, you're not in conflict. There's just,
Hmm.
if you fit that, that's great. So one of the things that I think stood out for me, and I just want to again quote from your book and have you comment, which is this idea that these very rigid categories are just kind of built in. It's kind of how the world is. And what you're saying here is for generations, we were taught that biological sex is a simple matter, that men are men and women are women, And to make sense of the variation we see in sex, gender, and sexuality, we're going to have to become comfortable, you say, with the concept of continuous categories, because that's how life really works. And to me, that's a very powerful and profound statement and reality that intuitively many of us say, oh, yeah, I mean, we've got to understand that. And others, it can seem scary. I mean, there's a broad world that for some can feel like, oh my God, if that's where do I fit?
Mhm.
What do I believe now? It turns over a lot of old things. But talk about that, science about the need to see the world in a broader, more
Right.
complex, and potentially more interesting and more possible ways in which we can be.
Yeah, but well, we humans have a brain that we prefer categories and strict definitions and strong boundaries, and where there's no confusion. And it's just not how life works. Things are always kind of fuzzy borders, and that doesn't mean that the categories are meaningless. Like for example, the example I use in my book, others have done this too. You have children and you have adults, and those are very clear categories. We know what those categories mean, and they're important differences. We have to treat those categories of individuals differently. Those are real true categories. But how do you tell them apart? Adolescence is a thing, and you don't go to bed one night as a child and wake up as an adult. Everyone knows that. We can appreciate how there is this transition period where it's not quite clear if you're a child or an adult, or you're in the process of changing from one to the other. That's a fuzzy category. It's a fuzzy border. For real categories. And I have to remember, I always have to remind people, I'm not saying the categories aren't real. The categories are real. Male is a thing, female is a thing. But there are individuals who, when some of their characteristics don't perfectly fit their sex typical bucket, whether that means their, waist hip ratio and their, some shape of their body, which gamete they make, even, their psychological inclination, all kinds of things. There are real sex differences in how our minds work and how our bodies are built and our relationships. There's all kinds of average sex differences, but there's always going to be people sort of in the middle on one category or another. And in fact, if we look at all of the sex differences that are out there, each one of us probably doesn't fit our sex typical bucket on some measure.
Right.
Maybe my red blood cell count is more in line with a typical female of my age. Maybe my liver enzymes look more like a male. There's all kinds of these little differences. And that doesn't mean that male and female are separate, but it does mean that there are people in different categories with different features that don't quite fit their bucket, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the normal expectation that we should have regarding variation. We know that people's minds don't all work the same way. We accept variation on that. Some people are more analytical and they're drawn to math, and other people are more creative. And there's nothing wrong with it. It makes a beautiful tapestry of the human species that we have all these kinds of differences. And the thing is we actually celebrate those differences in most ways, but we don't when it comes to sexual identity and gender expression. That's when because it threatens social order, people get very scared about that. People get very uncomfortable when they see a man walking down the street in a dress or a skirt. It violates our sense of social order regarding those. But yet we wouldn't have any problem with someone being very different with us in lots of other ways, right? And so I think that what I encourage people to consider is just to consider for a moment after reading my book and seeing all the variation out there in other animals, at least consider the possibility that maybe we're supposed to have this variation. Maybe that variation is built into our DNA and into our biological structure. And rather than be afraid of it, either A, ignore it, so tolerate it, ignore it, or maybe you might even find it interesting. I'm not trying to change anyone's religious beliefs about any of this stuff. I just want them to be a little bit more open-minded to the possibility that all the data that I read is that sexual diversity is good for a species. It
Indeed.
creates it creates what we call ecological resilience. What I
Mm.
mean by resilience is, listen, there's no way to predict the future. Evolution is always a game of chance. The environment changes, and what might be a great adaptation in one climate, it's not in another. The world, it's unpredictable. And so the species that fare the best are the ones that are the most diverse because you can't predict. So you might as well hedge your bets by having lots of variation, and then hopefully someone will have the right combination of traits for whatever the next challenge is. And the thing is we actually get that in all other ways except sex and gender. We accept that about height and weight and skills and all these kinds of things. We understand that variation is great for a species. Biologists have been discussing that since Darwin. And how variation is this insurance policy against an uncertain future. But why wouldn't it be the same for sex and gender? And I do give lots of examples in the book where sexual
Yeah,
variety really is important for a species. It helps them
indeed.
survive challenges. So, like for example, there are species that change sex from male to female, or rather, we should say, favor female sexual development during elevated temperature. And you're like, why would they do that? Well, elevated temperature in many climates is a sign of environmental catastrophe. And during times of environmental catastrophe, you need a lot more females because you're trying to rebound from a devastated population. So that's the kind of
Right.
flexibility that it has to be built in for it to work. On the other extreme, if you become overpopulated, there are many species that will favor male development when you become overpopulated. Why? Well, we don't need more individuals, so we might as well let them compete against one another to refine the gene pool. So you take advantage of the overpopulation to improve your genetic stock.
Well,
It's
that's what I
it's
found in your book was so helpful to tie into what we can learn from the other parts of the animal kingdom that many of us, as a biology major in college, I ate that stuff up.
yeah.
In the human world that I work on, I wanted to have you comment on a number of things that I thought were both interesting, controversial, and helpful to understand. In chapter 6, you have you explore what family values and topic of interest to everyone, and share a little bit of what you learned in that area that can be helpful for all of us because we're all interested in family values, but what that means in context can often separate people, and you bring in some new dimensions that I think are particularly helpful.
Right. Well, chapter 6 is basically my anthropology chapter, where we look at how cultures and time periods all around the world have approached these matters very differently than the way we're familiar with here in modern day Western culture and Eastern cultures. Has become very similar. We've sort of converged on this kind of two-parent nuclear family, but actually families have looked very differently in different cultures all around the world, and the idea of monogamy, for example, and strict lifelong marriage monogamy. That's one way to do it, but there's a lot of diverse ways around the world that other families have other cultures have presented themselves, and it's really the steamroller of civilization that kind of flattened all that diversity and said, no, 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 we're all going to do our families this way. So chapter 6 is a very brief tour through around the world and different ways that other cultures have approached sex, gender, sexuality, just to show off that humans can do this. It's not unnatural for humans to be arranged in different arrangements. So, for example, in the Himalayan mountains, there not just one or two. There's like 7 or 8 separate cultures that have a polyandrous family where you have a single female who is married to, in this case, brothers. So it's fraternal polyandry. So she might be married to 2, 3, 4, 5 brothers, and she's one wife to 5 brothers. And that we would find that completely crazy right now. But they've been doing it for thousands of years. It's how their culture is oriented. Our ways looks just as strange to them. And I talk a little bit about the ecological challenges of living in the Himalayas and why that might favor a
Mm,
society like that. Part of the thesis of that chapter is if you put a culture, put a people in an environment, the culture that will emerge is the one that makes the most sense for that environment, right? It's not a coincidence that people who live along the coastline eat seafood, right? No one would say that's a coincidence. And the people who live in the forest tend to eat roots and shoots and fruits. Well, that the same thing is true for family structures. It will take the shape that makes the sense for the
mm,
climate and the environment that they live in. And civilization brought with it a lot of structuring, a lot of hierarchy, and a lot of structuring. And of course, our family and other social structures adapted to that. Again, nothing wrong with it. If you love your nuclear family, I love my nuclear family. There's nothing wrong with that. But we to understand that history is to not devalue, it's just to appreciate other ways that it could have worked out and that it does work out for other people.
Super. And that's, I think, when we see that humans all over the world do things in a broad number of ways, it allows us to realize, one, we're not so different if we have a different view, and
Mhm.
if we have one view that's we've grown, that's ours. We like it and we can keep it, but there are other possibilities. I
Mhm.
want to get into chapter seven a bit, which is another, I think, real interesting chapter. Call it the sex and gender non-binary. And you say, of all the topics covered in this book, transgender visibility and acceptance seems to unsettle people the most. And I've certainly seen that in my clinical work with people and in my family. I've
Mhm.
got a lot of issues with children and grandchildren around those. So, can you share some of the things that both unsettle people and what we need to know that can kind of help us make sense of our own sex and love lives as well as those of others?
Yeah, well, the chapter on this issue in humans that you're mentioning. So the first half of the book is all about animals, right?
Right,
I barely mention humans at all in the first half, first two-thirds of the book, really. And then I get into
right,
mapping what we've learned on animals onto humans. So it's
right,
important to have that in mind because when I talk about transgender humans, you can't really talk about transgender animals in the sense that it requires you to understand something about how they identify, which isn't something we have access to with animals.
right,
Right. But what I do point out is all the sort of non-conforming or animals that don't fit the expected mold or the common mold, the most dominant, or however you want to see it. Those always exist in all these species. So I would say that the large transgender umbrella, that's the correlate in humans for humans whose gender identity doesn't match their expected expression given their biological sex. That's kind of one way to say that. And when you consider that we see that in other animals, it's not so unusual in humans. That's kind of the point of that chapter. But for some reason, even when humans, I know humans who are very accepting of the gay community, homosexuals or bisexuals and so forth. But with transgender, that seems to violate something else. It's not just about their sexual behavior; it's about the social order. And this is where I'm stepping outside of my lane a little bit because I'm not a sociologist. But it seems pretty clear and obvious to me that we are very invested in gender roles and gender expectations of gender as part of our social order. And things that violate social order are called deviant. And that the word deviant doesn't in the sociology literature isn't necessarily morally wrong. It
right,
just means deviating from the norm or deviating from the
right,
expectation. So deviant sexual expression or gender expression seems to really upset social order because so much of our I mean, just think about it. It's the first thing you ask about a baby. Is it a boy or a girl? Right? Like it's just how we structure the whole world. Our language, our pronouns, right, are gendered, and things like this. So we just have this two-team approach. Like, which team are you on? And when you have someone who doesn't fit either team perfectly, we don't know what to do with them. And it has this kind of unsettling sense. And what I found is most interesting is that the very earliest sort of transgender acceptance movements, through the 20th century, the middle part of the 20th century, they were all built around this idea of a female trapped in a man's body or vice versa. And for some reason, that was not as unsettling because it kept the social order of two teams, right?
right.
Oh, you're just on the wrong team. Okay, we'll get you on the right team, and then we're fine again because the two teams are still intact. But nowadays, the transgender community is much more flexible and fluid, and they're more embracing of a diversity, of a mosaic of features. And that's when it's just like, okay, which team are you on? I got to know which pronoun to use and that kind of thing. And I think it's interesting. It's also tragic, unfortunately, because it's we've got such a strong pushback right now. But I do think it's interesting that it's the diversity and the mosaicism that really upsets people more than the early phase of what we call transsexual history really was. And I hope that it's part of our sexual evolution to see, to go past that. Now, some people truly do want to be fully kind of switched from their assigned gender at birth. And great, and no shade. But there are other people who want to use a combination of traits and features that feel natural to them, and they want to wear a beard and wear a dress, and that's that kind of disharmony that we need to kind of work through and
Yeah,
say, well, that's okay. A dress isn't inherently sexual, is it? And
indeed. Well, as a clinician, in modern day world where you're working with people with all kinds of issues, I see that a lot in helping people get comfortable with who they are. It was kind of one part, and in my own family, I got an interesting, more personal, call, and it turned out one of my family members had gotten a call from one of his children, uh, saying that, "Have you heard about our son who now wants to be identified female?"
Mhm,
And I said, "No, I hadn't heard that." And anyway, I mean, it just shook him up to the roots.
mhm,
And then talked to, the person that was involved, and it was turned out to be uh, one of our mutual sons and son-in-law and their child. And what I was introduced to of this very now personal in family whole world of in our case, a 15-year-old saying, I feel female. I don't identify as male. And then what does that mean both for a 15-year-old, and we're seeing that in both younger people. And I
mhm,
wonder if you could just talk about a little bit more, in a sense, the modern current era of both the opening up of these issues, and then also how it now is affecting both younger, you know, kids that, makes me both glad that, you know, and then I think of myself when I was a 15-year-old and, felt some female male energies. And so maybe you could just expand kind of from your science and your background, what you see going on in this kind of current world where these issues both are talked about, and because younger people are, on media and they get influences by all kinds of, how do we navigate that, and how do parents,
yeah.
navigate these new issues that we never had to deal with in years past?
Right, right. Well, first of all, I do want to say I don't have a lot of answers here,
Yeah,
other than what I would say is I generally approach this from a first do no harm and
yeah,
also be open-minded. And what I found is that, a lot of a lot of a lot of adolescence is about staking out your own identity, right? So as children are becoming adults, and they're really trying to figure out who they are
right,
inside, and there can be a discordance with what's expected of them, and gender is just one way that could take place. And so it's somewhat normal, I think, that they do explore this. Some of these could be, feelings and identities that move through on time and are a little bit more fluid. And I think one thing that I would always counsel a parent to avoid is pushing back too hard, because what you don't want to do is make it about taking a stand and become is a child becoming defiant, and then they're going to fight
right,
you just because they want to dig their heels in and
right.
be the ultimate authority in their life. So I think the first thing you want to do is be very careful about how hard you push back, because you could have the opposite result. But the next thing I would say is that the students who do best in this scenario are the ones who don't feel like they have to do anything. They don't have to perform gender
Mm,
in any particular way. And so letting children just be who they are and what feels normal, and that will change as they, mature. My own, I've never had much of a transgender identity. I've always felt pretty male, but like how I express my maleness has changed as I grow older and
yeah,
as I work through adolescence. And in fact, I'm probably less experimental now than I was younger, even though I've been doing all this reading and do all this research. I think it's more of like well, as a gay male, it's okay if I identify mostly in masculine ways, because
Yeah,
that's just who I am. My sexual orientation has nothing to do with my gender identity. I mean, they're
indeed.
related in the sense that it comes up in similar
Right,
conversations, but they're not, one is not dependent on the other. And I think that with this flexibility and the increasing diversity that's out there, it'll help people kind of find where they more naturally fit, as long as they feel free,
right,
and you want to make sure you don't people aren't harming themselves and that kind of thing.
right,
But generally, if you keep a child safe and supported and loved, um,
right.
they're not going to want a battle with you. Most children
Exactly.
would be very happy to just not be
Yeah.
fighting this fight. So I think that's the better
Yeah,
approach.
that's what we've found. And you bring up in your chapter 8, and you've talked openly about, the gay gene and all the controversy over the years. Well, if you're gay and you've got the gene, then you can't help it. That's just who you are, kind of thing. And I thought it was a really interesting and nuanced exploration of these issues that many people both. Well, now I understand it. I understand whether you're gay or straight or what variations. At least we know now what it's this. And you've kind of expanded some of the more nuance of these ideas that I think are very helpful. And maybe could talk a little bit about some of the issues that you covered in that chapter and some of the, as a scientist and, what personally as part of your own life and your own experiences this can share that I thought was particularly helpful for everybody to just
Yeah.
understand these issues more in
Yeah,
depth.
there's been a lot of research that was designed to figure out how people become gay, or why people are gay. And I think a lot of it was fairly misguided, but we did learn some interesting things in along the way. I was somewhat um on the fence about whether to include a chapter on this stuff, just
Yeah,
because there's a lot of dark history there.
right,
Remember that homosexuality was classified as a mental illness for most of the history of modern medicine. So there was this idea of like what went wrong here,
right.
that was baked into the research. But we still found some really cool, interesting things that do speak a little bit about the natural origins of sexuality. I'll just give you an example. The very first real scientific study of gay men in London found that they tend to have more siblings than straight men do. Tend to come from bigger families. And then when scientists, and this has held up, by the way, across cultures around the world. And when scientists looked more deeply into it, what they found was that every time a woman, a uterus, gives birth to a child, every male that they have increases the chance that the next male will be gay. Not by a lot, but by a measurable amount that is consistent across cultures. So that the larger the family, the more likely that the younger males there would be gay. We still don't know why. There's lots of theories about where that could come from, but it does seem to happen. It could be social. There's lots. It could be environmental. Could be genetic. There's just a lot of confusion about why that could be. And rather than going into all the different hypotheses on this, I just want to say it's one of these things that to me, what it shows is that there is some kind of biosocial component to this.
Right.
Now, does that mean it's an advantage? Maybe. Could it be just sporadic and weird? We don't know. You don't really see it with gay females, so we don't know. But the point is that this is a real interesting biosocial phenomenon that that is consistent. So, and then I go through the various ideas that people have had about where homosexualities come from. Most of these have all been debunked, including the idea that there's a discrete gene called the gay gene. There's no such gene. Believe me, if there were, we would have found it. There's lots and lots of studies have been done on this kind of thing. But what we have found is that there are bits of genetic information across all the chromosomes that seem to correlate. And the summary of this is I say, people ask, is being gay genetic? And I say, yes, but it's genetic in the way that having a kidney is genetic. Not in the way that blue eyes versus brown eyes are genetic, but rather than there are genetic components to this. Lots of genes across all of our chromosomes all contribute to our orientation. And then it also takes shape in a social environment. What you're exposed to as a child, as you're developing your sexuality, that does impact what you're attracted to as an adult. We know that. We don't know how, but we know that it happens. And you can see this across cultures, how different cultures value different things. in their sexuality and different, even different time periods. What is attractive in one time period isn't the same, even in the same culture, in a different time period. So some kind of exposure matters too. I think it's interesting that we study these things, but I don't think we're ever going to get nice, clean answers to this. It's
Right.
one of these systems that's designed to be noisy. It's
Right.
designed to be diverse because once again, back to the first statement I made
Right.
is diversity is the goal of life, is to
Exactly.
create a diverse population.
That's so, so important that we get that knowledge and recognition because I think we'd all agree, or anybody that studied, the world as we live it today, that, humans, are not necessarily going to live forever as a species. Species come and go if we're not adapted and we don't take care of our environment and such. And so diversity over, time is what's allowed, us as a, a species and as a whole uh, animal kingdom to stay alive and change and adapt to our times. So we could talk a whole lot more. I feel like we could spend many hours talking, and we need to wrap up just for our time. And so I just want to ask you two final things. One is there's anything else that you'd want to leave us with that we haven't covered that you feel is important? And then secondly, how people can learn more about the book and where they can find it, and more about your work to find out a little bit more broadly, since we now know that you've written other books and you have a broader range of things that I think are very interesting and how people can learn more about that.
Well, the one thing to answer the first part of your question of what I want people to take from this overall is, I'd like to think my books are actually fairly uplifting and fairly optimistic.
Yeah.
I try to make them more celebratory than angry.
Yeah.
There's no angry rants in this book.
That's
But
true.
what it really is a celebration of biology is so interesting. It's so fascinating how life unfolds on this planet, and we're learning more about it all the time. So I think the people who will like this book is not just those who have a specific interest in gender sexuality, but if you just like nature and biology and how life, the natural history of things, this I hope is a celebration of biodiversity because sexual diversity is biodiversity. And there
Yeah.
will be a lot of animals that I'll introduce you to that you've never heard of that you're going to want to go read more about. Even my last book, which is called Human Errors, is only about humans, but it looks through our evolutionary lens and it talks about flaws in the human body. But even those, there's a happy reason why we have a lot of those flaws. It's not all doom and gloom. It's actually we're a very unique species and we're worth celebrating because we got the way we are because of this big cognitive capacity. But that changed the way we interact with one another. And it also means that we don't live or die based on how well our body works anymore, right? Most
Mm.
animals do, how fast they can run, how good they can see. That's life or death. But for us, if you don't see very well, that's okay. You can contribute in a different way. There's so many different ways that we can contribute. And again, that harkens back to diversity as our best feature. And so it really is a celebration of all forms of diversity without condemning, anything. The next thing, the second question is, how do you find me? Luckily, I'm the only Nathan Lentz that seems to write about any of this stuff. So if you Google Nathan Lentz, you'll find my other books, my other writings, my web pages, that kind of thing. And the book has gotten a lot of interest from people who are sort of already thinking along these lines. And of course, I love getting this book into the hands of people who feel heartened. But I wish more people who were skeptical or on the fence would read the book because I'd like to
Good.
hear
Yeah.
that it opened minds. I feel like it's most of it got written up in the New Yorker and Newsweek and all these places, but it's only the only people I hear from are the people who already believed all the things that I'm saying. So I would love to hear more from people who didn't walk into the book super excited about sex and gender diversity, who might be very baked into traditional thinking about these. And if you have a counterpoint, if you really think that I missed the boat on some issues, reach out to me. I generally respond to pretty much any email that's kind, that's written to me. Obviously,
Yeah,
writing in this area, I do get some nasty ones, so
yeah.
I don't respond to those. But most of the people who've written me have been kind, and I would love to engage in a conversation about this because I
Well,
don't think
that's
any of us has all the answers, and certainly no one gets the last word. So I would love to hear from people who maybe aren't interested in sexual diversity, but who like animals, and maybe their mind might be opened a little bit by looking at our animal cousins.
Well, that's super. Well, I will, be putting this out, as I said to you, to my community, which is a very diverse community, and I'm sure you'll get things. I want to stay in touch with you and hear more and stay, in dialogue around these issues because they're important and they're interesting and fascinating, and you approach things in a way that is very heartening and very positive. So we'll
Thank
say
you.
goodbye for now and look forward to staying in touch in the future.
All right, sounds great. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.